The police in the United States of America are prejudiced, and it's systemic. Well, by now you're probably saying something like, "Hey, Nyberg, tell me something I don't know." Well, I would like to tell you a couple of things that maybe you don't know, because it might not be what you think. Now, this topic's been batted around for a long time, but I think I may have some, I don't want to call them solutions, let's call them mitigations. Let's call them helpful strategies. It's at least worth a conversation, so let's go. It is Nothing But the Truth, your criminal investigations podcast. My name is Ramesh Nyberg, your host. I'm a retired homicide investigator, a Miami native, a dad, a granddad, a writer, and apparently a podcast host. This is the place for real talk about criminal investigations. No BS, no Hollywood nonsense. We discuss everything from the 1980s and all the cocaine craziness to what's happening today in the world of criminal investigations. So hop on board. This is bound to be a lot of fun for at least one of us. For some reason, I keep thinking of Billy Joel's song, "We Didn't Start the Fire." It's always been burning, right? Something like that. As you know, if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, I'm not an apologist, never will be, never have been. I just like to identify things and hopefully bring a different perspective to the public's understanding of what goes on in police work and what goes on in investigations. And this horrifying incident with the Memphis, Tennessee police and this unfortunate young man, Tyre Nichols, got me thinking about a lot of things. Anyway, before we get into that, thank you for coming back. It's good to have you back. For those of you who are new to the podcast, I am a retired homicide investigator. I've spent 27 years of my career, all of my career here in Miami-Dade County in South Florida. 22 of those years were in homicide. The other times I spent in uniform. So I like to bring that kind of perspective to this podcast so that hopefully listeners, whether they're general lay people that don't know anything about law enforcement or people that are students of criminal justice, might get a deeper understanding of some things that are not necessarily reflected in their training and certainly are not reflected in Hollywood. Before I get into all that, I'd like to follow up on what I said in the intro or just before the intro, and that was that the police are prejudiced. They are. Not quite in the way you might think. I know that there's a strain of thought and a segment of the population that believes that there is a vast, almost subconscious conspiracy against people of color in police work that dates back to the days of slavery and whatnot. And I'm sorry, I just don't buy it. And this is not a political podcast, never will be. But there are just some things that need to be understood. First of all, when I started in police work back in 1979, it was a totally different era. It was an era where police officers didn't carry tasers. They had not been invented yet. We carried mace, which was a chemical spray that I don't ever recall even using in my 27 years on the job. We had to rely on a different way of dealing with people. And were there brutal incidents? Absolutely there were. There have been since the beginning of time. And as we get further into the podcast later on, I want to discuss some strategies that hopefully we can mitigate these things from happening. But what's important to understand here is that I think our society has changed a lot. I dare say that today's young people, and that's where our police officers come from, today's young people are not as good at communicating verbally as they used to be when I was starting out in police work. Now, some of my students might be recoiling in horror or feeling hurt or insulted, and it's not meant to be that at all. It's no one's fault. I just think it's the way things have evolved in our society and the way we entertain ourselves and the way we communicate with each other that have just kind of put verbal communication a little lower on the totem pole, right? Oh, God, can you say totem pole anymore? I'm sorry. A little lower on the ladder. And I see this because I teach. and I've been teaching for quite some time, and I've seen changes in the way students respond and the way students even interact with each other. But anyway, I run the risk of going down a rabbit hole here, which happens from time to time, talking about these things. So I want to kind of stay on track. Let's talk about what we mean by prejudice and bias. And I think that I was a victim of this myself, having spent 6 years on the road in some very bad neighborhoods and some good ones, and spent 22 years in investigating murders and other death cases, and seeing just how horrible humanity can be, how brutally and terribly we can treat each other. All this takes an emotional toll on a young person who has not necessarily gotten the type of training they need to endure this kind of stuff, and I'm really not sure there is any workable, viable training that can address those things. You have to experience them firsthand. But that's later for the strategies that I'm going to talk about. I want to talk about this prejudice thing. What are police officers prejudiced about? Who are they prejudiced against? Who are the targets of their bias? And I can tell you very simply, and this might sound corny, but they're biased against lawbreakers. They're biased against criminals. They're prejudiced against people who go out and brutalize innocent people because they see it over and over again. They deal with the victims constantly. They have to sit with the victims and the witnesses and try to engage with that terror and fear and frustration that victims of crime have to go through. And it's a cycle that never stops. And what happens is, in a young person, they start to develop this feeling that, and excuse the blunt nature of this phrase, people are assholes, which of course is not true. I think human beings have the capability of being wonderful and great and creative and loving. They also have the capability of being horribly brutal, cold, and indifferent, greedy, dishonest. Throw in all the other adjectives you want because you know where I'm going. But when you're a police officer, you don't see a lot of the good, loving, kind nature that I was just describing. You see the other side all the time. And so you tend to start to develop this bias. And when you start to deal with somebody that you think has done something wrong, it can get you angry. Now, again, I'm not defending anybody's actions here. I'm trying to explain it. That anger manifests in different ways depending on the person, on the individual personality. And then when you encounter somebody who you know has done something wrong, or at least you suspect has done something wrong, you start to formulate these ideas about them, and then all of a sudden they run from you, or they shove you, or knock your partner down in an attempt to get away, or God knows what else. And then you're chasing them, and then your adrenaline is gushing. And then you catch them. And here's where maybe one of the only things that's black and white in police work, and I'll tell you what that is. Once the handcuffs go on, the fighting stops. That is what is supposed to happen. And we know full well that's not what always happens. It doesn't matter what they did. It doesn't matter what they said. It doesn't matter whether they shoplifted or whether they raped a little child. You can't do anything to them once they're under control and no longer a threat. That's the key phrase. Under control, no longer a threat. Not even a slap is justified as much as you might want to do it. Every time one of these things happens, and they will happen again, they will. They're going to happen again because we hire human beings, and we have to get better at that, and that's one of my strategies I want to talk about later on. Every time one of these things happens, it refuels the conversation about we have a systemic problem with police. And I agree, it is systemic. But what does systemic mean, and how do we assess that statistically? Someone in law enforcement, I think it was from the International Association of Chiefs of Police, if I'm not mistaken, and I might be, who said there are 3 million police-citizen encounters a year. That means 3 million times a year, police officers engage with someone in the public, whether that's a call for service, a traffic stop, an arrest, whatever type of engagement that might be, 3 million of those. Now, I don't know how he came to that number. Maybe people have been doing some research on that. I have no way of giving you my opinion on whether that's accurate or not. But if it is accurate, then you would have to start counting up all the violent encounters, and then you would have to kind of decide which ones were justifiable or not to get to any kind of ratio if you want to look at things statistically. If you went to a restaurant and you saw a rat running across the floor, I'm sure you would tell the manager, maybe never go to the store again, and you might even tweet it on your social media or, Instagram or what have you, and talk about what a terrible experience it was. And on social media, you might have a whole bunch of other people say, yeah, you know what? I was at a restaurant in Orlando and the same thing happened. We saw a rat heading towards the kitchen or coming out of the kitchen. And then somebody else, yeah, I had a, fly in my soup at this place in Tallahassee. And before you know it, you've got this, as they say, going viral thread of information about how dirty, unhealthy, and unsanitary America's restaurants are. Now, I'm making this whole thing up. But then you would have to look at, okay, how many restaurants are there in the United States? I don't know. How often does this happen? Ratios and being able to say, is this an epidemic? Is this systemic? I really don't know how you come to those conclusions. But I do know this. As a society, we all want to mitigate it. We all want it to be better. I think I speak for most people in all walks of life, in all beliefs, in all political persuasions, when I say that we want better police officers on the road. We want them to be smarter. We want them to be more mature. We want them to make better decisions. We want them to be more compassionate. And we want less innocent people getting brutalized. How do we do it? Well, I have a couple of strategies that are not necessarily new earth-shaking strategies. I'm sure they've been discussed before. In my estimation, one of the biggest problems we've always had in police work ever since I started was we hire people too young and too immature. My God, when I first started in police work, you could get a job with the Miami-Dade Police Department at the age of 19. 19. I mean, I shudder to think of it. They've changed that since then, but not much. 19 is way too young to give someone a badge and a gun. You're fresh out of high school. Now, don't talk to me about the military. That's a different matter. Sending people at the age of 18 or 19 to the military and training them in that very specific discipline of attending to the tasks of war, that's a different matter altogether. Police officers are not soldiers, and they're not fighting a war. They're dealing with human beings. They are serving the public. They're public servants. It's a different matter altogether. Well, here's strategy number one. I believe we need to raise the hiring age. And let me back up. These strategies, to me, are a smaller part of a larger effort, and I would call that effort professionalizing. Now, we've called law enforcement a profession for a long time, but it needs to undergo a new era of professionalism. Number one, we need to hire people minimum age 25. Minimum age 25. Maybe 23 if you have a 4-year degree or have done 4 years in the military. Now, does 4 years in the military or 4 years in college teach you how to be a good police officer? No, it doesn't. But what it does is it forces you to engage in adult, mature tasks and challenges that help you become more mature, that give you more life experience, that make you a more responsible person, hopefully. We cannot hire 19 and 20 or even 21-year-old people who have not had some life experience. I was hired at 21. That's when I started my police career. I was hired and put into the police academy July of 1979, graduated December of 1979. And I was too young. I look back on that now, and I know I was too young. I needed more maturity. We need to get more mature, level-headed people on the job. The second thing that has to integrate with that strategy, the second strategy would be the training has to be longer but better. and there has to be more training in the area of communication. I said it before, I believe that we communicated better verbally with people back in the day, as they say. Why? Because it served us well. None of us wanted to be rolling around on the floor with anybody. You didn't want to go home with a dirty, bloody uniform. You didn't want to run the risk of getting hurt or killed. So you learned how to talk to people, and we were better communicators. Training, okay? So the training has to be better, and right along with that, the supervision has to be better. When I was in uniform, they had just started something called the Field Training Officer Program. Rolled it out, I believe, around 1983 or 84. I was waiting to go to Homicide. I wanted to get out of the district and go to Homicide. But I thought, while I'm waiting, I'll put in for this thing. So I applied for it. They interviewed me, and I became a field training officer, an FTO, as we call it. And I enjoyed that. I really liked it. It was a good program, but it could have been better. And one of the problems was the department didn't stress enough that the field training officers also have to be mature, responsible, courageous people who are willing to fail a recruit if they didn't meet up to the standards. And to be honest with you, a lot of FTOs didn't want to go through the hassle of failing anybody because you had to write up a big report and explain why you're failing them. And, you get the personal thing of, oh my God, you failed me. You must hate me. I had a bunch of recruits and I failed 2 of them. And one of them came up to me later and said, you did the best thing in the world for me by failing me because I had to go back to my previous writing assignment. There were 3 phases of this, right? They went to 3 different FTOs. I was the final one, the third one. He had to go back to his second one and he said, you did wonders for me. It was the best thing that ever happened to me because I was not ready to go out. And I knew that. And he acknowledged it. We need courageous trainers and courageous supervisors who are not interested in being somebody's buddy, but instead being somebody's mentor, because that's the person that's going to back you up on a dangerous call one day. I want good police officers out there. I'm not going to turn a blind eye when somebody has a deficiency. That's who we need, training young officers. The training needs to be intense. It needs to be scrutinized at several levels, and we can't have people 2 years out of the police academy training recruits. They need to be more mature than that. There's a system that has to be overhauled, and it doesn't happen overnight. The third and final strategy isn't really a strategy at all because it's going to be very difficult for the department to carry out, but I would just say that they should encourage officers to have hobbies, to have things to do outside of law enforcement, maybe even change the work week, maybe not have 5 days. City of Miami Police long ago went to 4-10s, right? 4 days a week, 10-hour shifts. I don't know. That's not my expertise, that area, but changing it so that you have a variety of different tasks. Maybe you're not on patrol all the time. Maybe you're on patrol 3 days a week and maybe you do something else the other 2 days. I don't know if that's feasible, but there has to be some interruption of the onslaught that police officers face every day, the emotional onslaught. It needs to be softened. It needs to be changed up, and I'm not sure how that's done, but I think that might be something that the law enforcement world needs to look into to keep their officers mentally healthy. As I said, it's going to happen again. Sadly, it will happen again, because even if you implement all 3 strategies I just talked about, some people are going to still slip through the cracks. Unfortunately, law enforcement from time to time, attracts people who are into power and into controlling people more than they are into serving them. It's still going to happen. The same way thieves are attracted to being the treasurer at the church, and child molesters are attracted to being teachers and coaches. The low-hanging fruit, friends, the opportunities. We look for opportunities. Some people look for good ones. Some people are geared differently and have unfortunate intent. And those are the people I'm still prejudiced against. Guys, thank you for listening. I've just finished my book, Badge, Tie, and Gun, Life and Death Journeys of a Miami Detective. I've got it with an agent now. I'm very excited. It's a memoir about my life growing up in Miami, becoming a police officer, and eventually a homicide detective. I'll keep you posted on the progress of that and where we're going with it. One day it'll be in print, and then, of course, I'll be shouting from the rooftops about where you can get it. Hope you'll be around for the next episode, hopefully in another 2 weeks or so. And as I like to say, always put your best foot forward, but don't forget to work on your other foot. Take care, everyone.